There comes a time with a miniature painter when they look upon their projects with despair. For there are some projects that have not yet been finished. There are some miniatures that are just barely even started. And then there are those that have not yet even been primed. Seeing this, you realize that there's only one thing you can do.
On second thought, let's do something different. Greetings, and welcome back to Mediocre Minis. For this video, I decided to do something a bit different. My original plan was to film the entire assembly and painting process of a Sylvaneth Archer Revenant. However, this past week, while I was really in the mood to paint, I wasn't really in the mood to paint that specific miniature. And that's okay. Sometimes you just aren't feeling it. And when you have those moments and you still want to paint, it's important to take that spark and to still put your creativity to use. So, for this video, we're going to do things differently. But first, we need to go on an adventure. So there we go. After my adventure into my garage, we've come up with this box right here. Now, for this box, there's going to be a few different steps in the process. First is to take all of my unpainted miniatures and throw them in. The second step of this process is to find a willing participant to reach in and grab a miniature at random. And I know exactly who will be the first person to help.
Can I move this?
Alright, so here's what we're going to do. I dragged my wonderful wife, Vaultfox, down from, the office and upstairs and out of the hobby dungeon. And she is the first person to actually choose one of the Mediocre Mystery Minis. So, Vaultfox.
Do I have to do this?
Please.
Okay.
So, anything you like out of the box. It can be a miniature that is unwrapped, or it could be one that's wrapped up. Whatever you like.
Banana!
What is it?
Layla.
Ah!
Layla!
We're doing a Dark Elf today.
Is it Layla? Leela?
Aliyah, here we go again. Thank you, Vaultfox.
Alright, bye. I'm gonna eat your microphone now.
Ah!
Ow.
Now, the third step in this process is to be choosing a primary color to work with. Now, when I say a primary color, I don't necessarily mean red, yellow, and blue. What I mean is, what will be the main theme? Will it be a darker shades? Will it be lighter shades? And how are we going to end up choosing this is also going to be at random. And I have just the individual to help pick it out. Hi. So, what I'm going to do is take some of my dog's favorite treats. I'm going to put them in front of the 6 primary colors, and then we're going to see which one he eats first. And that's the color that we will be using to paint as a primary color on the miniature itself. Okay, now it's time for the dog of the design. Hey Ares, come here.
Okay.
Which one do you want?
Yeah, that's my dog!
Looks like we're going with green.
Okay, so now that we have all of the colors and the miniature picked out, it's time to get started. This is a Reaper Bones miniature like many of the other miniatures that I have in my box at this point. And one thing to keep in mind when you're using Reaper Bones is some of the plastic is very malleable and sometimes can be very flexible. You can see here that the staff is very bendy, and same with the arm with the dagger in it. Normally this isn't too much of a problem, and I've never experienced many issues with Reaper miniatures, but it's one of those things to keep in mind as you are using those miniatures in particular. Then I decided to mount it to a smaller base. I use way too much super glue on this, and that's not normally too much of a problem. You just let it sit and you'll be ready to go soon afterwards. After the glue is dried, I attach it to a handle. It's by Red Grass Games. I'm not sponsored by them, I just happen to have the handle and I really like it. Keeps everything nice and steady as you are working. Then I'll move through and get my color palette all ready to go. I use a variety of shades of green. Most of these are from scale 75, though I do happen to use some of the Reaper paint line in this also. First main step is to go through and apply a base coat to the miniature. Now, a base coat's important as it lays down the general basis of what you want your miniature to look like. I decided to go with a darker green, following the given color palette. At times like this, sometimes it's fun to come up with a story or some sort of background for the miniature that you're working on. It can help drive exactly what you want this miniature to become. For instance, as I was painting this, I figured that this individual, she was from a swamp and used a lot of green flora and fauna in part of her garb. One of her main goals is to protect her home, so hence having the staff and the dagger and the type of defense so that she can be protective as possible to her home and her people. Now, when using any paint, sometimes you might have to use additional coats to lie down a fully opaque base coat, and that's perfectly fine. Put down a coat, let it dry, come back and do any touch-up later on. I actually had to do 3 coats of the lighter shade of green for her hair because one, it's a lot lighter and it actually required more coats. And you can see here I have the robes that she's wearing and her hair already base coated. From this point, I'll move on to some of the other garments that she's wearing, such as around her legs and on her wrists. I chose to do a much darker green so it would stand out more. Now you'll see here on the one legs it was a brighter green. I'm going over top of it. I figured maybe we'll give this a try, but after doing one leg I decided I didn't like it and I just painted over it. And that's the great thing with paint. You can just go over it again and you'll be in pretty good shape. Of course, in the more extreme cases you can strip the entire miniature of all of its paint, but I didn't feel I needed to do that for this. I did actually shoot footage of her armor and her skin. However, I didn't lose it in editing, so we're just going to skip right forward to me painting the staff. I went with a very light shade of grayish purple for her skin, and I decided to make the armor a yellow or greenish yellow, and the staff, of course, brown. This is where I realized I forgot to do some of the wrappings along the top of the staff and also the gems on the top, so I just went back and did it now. You also notice that I actually forgot to do the dagger at this point, but I'll remember much later on, and then I'll add some of a nice blade steel silver to that later on. Now I'm going back doing a little bit of touch-up work, and you'll see here the base coat is completely on the miniature, all ready to go, and everything is fully opaque. One thing I do have to note, I did enjoy the color of the greenish yellow for the armor, but I will have to say that on occasion it would be nice to have much more suitable clothing on some women miniatures. I know sometimes it does make sense, but I mean, come on, give me some armor. Next step is called shading. This is where I take some of Citadel's Earthrax Earthshade and I apply it to all of the cloth and the staff on the miniature. What this does is, while it does make all of the paint a much darker shade, we can go back and fix that later, but it also settles into the recesses, giving some depth to the miniature that we're working on. More specifically, on the cloak and on the wrappings, it will appear that the more recessed areas are much darker and the areas further away from that are much lighter. And this is what the miniature will look like after you apply the shade. It's actually called a wash. It does take a little bit of time to dry, so it's best to let it sit for sometimes a half hour to an hour for the wash to fully cure and dry, so you don't move it around or mess it up or blend it with another shade that you don't really want to do. I should learn how to focus better. I also do the same process with the skin and the hair, except for the skin I'm using a flesh tone and I'm using a darker shade called Nun Oil for the hair. I really do like the flesh shade because it does settle into the recesses very, very nicely, and you can really get some of the details out of a lot of figures. Now what I'm doing on here on the hair is I am actually using a damp brush that's clean of all the wash to actually draw some of the wash away and pull some of the excess, so I don't have too many pulls and recesses where I have dark blotches everywhere. It's always easier to go back and remove what you do not need as opposed to having too much later and then having to go back over top of it. But to remove it, all you really need is a damp brush, set it right next to the pool of shade where you want to remove, and the brush will just almost suck it right up. Now, since many of the areas were darkened due to the wash that was used, I'm now going back in with the original green for the cloak and actually highlighting. The goal of this is to bring up some of the more areas that are further away from the recesses, and this includes edges, some of the folds in the cloth. Now it's important to remember when you're doing any highlighting is do not cover up the darker areas that were shaded. If you cover them up, it takes away the point of doing it in the first place. You don't need to do this step, however it does bring a lot of dimension and it makes your miniature pop a lot more than if you weren't to do it at all. Early in my time miniature painting, I actually didn't go back and do many highlights, and looking back on some of those miniatures now, it's very clear that I painted it, slapped on a wash, and called it done. And I'm also doing the same process here for the hair. It's the same exact green I used before, but I'm putting it on the tips of the hair, on the gem, on the end of her staff, and once it dries, you'll be able to see a really nice transition from the darker areas to a lighter area. And you can do these highlights as many times as you want. I actually go back for a third time for the hair. I take a little bit of white and I mix it in with the green to get a lighter shade, desaturation, so to speak, and then I apply that paint on the ends of her hair, on the tips of the hair, and it really gives a nice dynamic shift between the two. I do a few tertiary highlights also on the cloak. It does make some of the very highest edges stand out. And it looks very extreme at first whenever you have the wet paint, but after it dries, most paint does darken a little bit once it is dried, so you don't have to worry about too much of a contrast, at least while it's wet. And again, if you make a mistake, you can always just go back and fix it. Yep, and I still didn't remember I have to do that dagger. Look at all this footage of my hand that I left in, as opposed to taking out. Here's some more highlights on the armbands and wristbands. I believe I took the I believe it's called Dark Olive by Reaper, and I mixed a small amount of white into it to actually get a lighter tone so that I was able to go in with all the highlights. And just a little bit more touching up of the dark green. And as I mentioned before, here's that third highlight for the hair. It is the smallest highlight, and I'm covering the smallest amount of area so that all three shades actually show through. When highlighting, it's always nice to use the side of the brush as opposed to the tip, so you can get a very nice smooth transition for where you're painting, well, from the paintbrush to the miniature itself. And also, if you use the tip, you can actually end up screwing up a small amount and getting way too much paint or going in the wrong direction. I believe here I'm doing a fourth highlight of the hair, or applying a very small amount of the brightest shade of green that I mixed up, just to highlight some of the specific areas of her head. And now I decided to go on to add on some basing materials. I've done this in my Arch Revenant video where I take a little bit of PVA glue, which in this case is Elmer's glue, water it down a very small amount, and simply paint the glue onto the base. When doing this with a paintbrush, I would most certainly use a brush that you don't mind getting screwed up, because you are mixing it with glue, and while you can wash it out, I wouldn't use a very nice paintbrush for this process. And taking some of my rocks that I got from Michael's, sprinkling it on, and then tapping off any excess. And then there we have it. I have the entire miniature, and it's at this moment I realized her dagger's still white. We need to change that. There we go. Take some of the Reaper miniature blade steel and cover both the hilt and the blade of the dagger. Sometimes you gotta do a lot of maneuvering around to make sure you get all the spots covered so that when you're looking at it and rotating the miniature in your hand, you can actually see everything. And then finally, to give the dagger a little bit of pizzazz, I added a small amount of blood red to the end of it, as if she just got out of a battle.
And there we have it. The first Mediocre Mystery Mini is completed. Now I hope to do this again in the future, maybe choose some different colors, and I also have a bunch of other miniatures that still have yet to be painted. So, if you like this video, consider leaving a comment down below about what you like, what you don't like, what you'd like to see improved. I'd be really interested in hearing your feedback. Also, if you're up to it, maybe give it a good old like, maybe that little old subscribe. Doesn't cost anything, and believe it or not, it actually helps a channel like this out. With all that being said, keep painting, and I shall return.